Kia ora mai tātou, tēnā tātou katoa. Members, before the dinner break we were debating the Appropriation 2014-15 Supplementary Estimates Bill and the Impress Supply First for 2015-16 Bill, and the Honourable Clayton Cosgrove was speaking. He has 9 minutes remaining to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Clayton Cosgrove.
Before the dinner break, I followed, I can't remember the gentleman's name, a National Party Member of Parliament who took us on a sort of whirlwind tour of the OECD and rattled off about 5 to 6 minutes of statistics trying to make a proposition that this was somehow exceedingly relevant to the lives of, say, perhaps young New Zealanders who were trying to execute the dream of a first home buy, or those, as if these statistics would somehow keep people warm in their state houses or their private accommodation that may well be damped, underheated and pretty disreputable. Well, I've got to say to that member that he can throw statistics around for hour after hour, but what actually counts in Struggle Street out in the communities is the here and now, the income in the pocket or lack of it, the ability to put food in the mouths of your kids, and the ability to have decent housing and the basic baskets of goods and services that probably all of us, most of us in this Parliament, had the privilege of growing up with over the years. The member then also sort of waxed eloquently about how the surplus, and in fact I think it was Mr Bennett made a wonderful proposition actually. He attacked the opposition for claiming that the government had not met its #1 promise of going into surplus, and then admitted after a sort of couple of minutes later that they were edging towards surplus and that they had remained in deficit for the last 7 years. So he attacked us for telling the truth and then didn't provide any sort of evidence or proposition as to why the government, one, broke its premier gold-plated #1 promise to the electorate that they would. In fact, the Prime Minister, I think as Mr Hipkins pointed out, said before the election campaign, not they would, but they were in surplus to the tune of $300+ million, and then we find out it's the other way, it's $680-odd million in deficit. So while Mr Bennett sort of attacks the opposition for holding the government to account and telling the people of New Zealand that they continually, on 7 occasions, broke their promise, you know, that's our job, Mr Bennett. That's our job. And I would just make, if we're sort of bandying around statistics, just offer one for those historians in the audience and those listening tonight. When we left office in 2008, we had 9 years of surpluses. Crown debt, net Crown debt, 0, and 9 years of surpluses, compared to a government that has whose debt outstrips Sir Robert Muldoon, the great National Party hero, and my word, he was, we thought, the last of the big spenders. The debt outstrips him, and we have had 7 years of deficit. Now, the next proposition that the National Party, of course, put up in the budget is that there will be a $176 million surplus, they say. Now, as Mr Hipkins pointed out, if you do the math on that, and I know the member, Mr Scott, who's prone to telling the truth in this Parliament, we'll get to KiwiSaver home loan stuff in a moment, his favourite topic. If you do the basic math and you work out that the KiwiSaver $1,000 kickstart, which is gone, equates to $175 million, so by cutting that out, they somehow achieve a surplus, that gives them a surplus of a paltry $1 million. Now, for those people who might be tuning in tonight, $1 million is a lot of money, I accept that, but in the whole scheme of the government accounts, it is wafer thin, tissue thin, transparently thin, and I doubt whether that will be achieved. But you've got to look at some of the spendings in the budget and the supplementary estimates. I made an interesting discovery. I note that the Police Minister this afternoon said, in answer to a proposition put to him, that there had been a cut in the police vote. He denied it. But if you actually look at the, and I know Mr Speaker, of course, given his previous occupation, may indeed take a passing interest in this, but if you look at the budget documents, you note that there's a cut to the police operational funding of $44 million over 4 years. $44 million over 4 years. And then if you flip over a few pages, you'll see that Whānau Ora gets an additional $50 million for something called navigators. Now, I don't know what that means, and I bow to those in the House, Mr Macleay and others, who are far more proficient on government policy than I, but at the same time as you cut $44 million out of the police vote, you bung $50 million into Whānau Ora for something called navigators, at the same time and with no rebuttal and no examination of the effectiveness of Whānau Ora, to the point where the Auditor-General said, quote, "It is not easy to describe what it," that being the policy of Whānau Ora, "it is not easy," quote, "it is not easy to describe what it is or what it has achieved," unquote. Now, we had a lot of members over there talking about the effectiveness of government spending. Well, when the Auditor-General, who is an officer of Parliament independent of everybody here, including the government, who's charged with examining the government accounts and the appropriateness and the effectiveness of spending, comes out and says one of the biggest expenditures in this government's ongoing budget program, one of its flagship policies, where it gives an additional $50 million, and the AG says, quote, "It is not easy to describe what it," that is the policy, or what it is, or what it has achieved. Now, I'd be really grateful if somebody in government would stand up and probably and explain, give the answer that the AOG has been unable to find. I note in the media, and I'm not sure whether it was the Maori Party or somebody else, demanded then that the Auditor-General apologise for what she said. Well, why should she? She's actually charged with examining the effectiveness and appropriateness of expenditure, and she can't work it out, and she's a pretty learned individual. They have a pretty formidable office with an independent, world-class reputation. So I'd like somebody over there to sort of get up and perhaps explain to the New Zealand people what the program's about, whether it's been effective, and if it has, where the evidence is, and what the additional $50 million is for. Equally, I'd just note for the record, sir, that I find it interesting that the largest expenditure of Whānau Ora went to one particular seat of the former member, Turiana Turia, the author of the policy. Now, happenstance? Maybe. Coincidence? Possibly. But I don't particularly believe that. Whereas 8% of the Maori population who reside in that electorate and the largest bulk of Whānau Ora money just happen to land inside those boundaries. Now, there may be a good reason to be fair. I make no judgment. But I think an explanation is due, sir. So when we get into the sort of looking at the histrionics, sir, of this budget, I think it was a number of the other colleagues who said, who's going to benefit from this grand plan? Because we've got expenditure cuts, we've got expenditure which cannot be explained, sort of poured down the toilet, and nothing in this budget or these supplementary pieces of legislation can I find an effective plan to house those people in derelict and substandard accommodation. Nick Smith had a crack, as I said this afternoon, you know, the cheese slid off his cracker a couple of times over the last 6 or so months, 170 houses since 2013 in his so-called special housing areas, when we need 10,000 houses a year in Auckland to keep pace. Mr Scott's want to sort of wax eloquently about the KiwiSaver proposition. Well, it equates to $521 per year, sir, of extra funding. That's about $10 a week. And Mr Scott, when we had this debate a few months ago, it was Mr Scott who was the only honest man in the National Party who got up and actually admitted that's what it was. He said it's $10 a week extra when Auckland house prices are going up by $17,000 a month or 90 grand a year. So I asked those members as they sort of celebrate their great Kiwi Home Start, whatever it is, policy, answer me this. How is that going to affect and assist in a positive way those people who are up against a $17,000 a month housing inflation in Auckland, and they get $521 of their own money to spend per year? Mr Scott, you've done this Parliament a service. You're the only honest man on that side to tell the truth.